Cool. So everything is good?
Is this your screen that we're seeing? আমি মাঝখানে?
হ্যাঁ, মানে I put it like on the যাতে তোকে মানে আমি জাস্ট দেখতে চাইছিলাম যে এইখানের মোডটাতে কি কি দেখো।
So sorry for making you wear a shirt and all on a Saturday early morning.
No, that's okay. The timing was so weird because yesterday I had this submission, right? So
আমি 4টে বাজতে 2-3 মিনিট
অ্যাডমিট করে দেবো।
শোনা যাচ্ছে একদম, কিন্তু ছবিটা কিরকম একটা আসছে জানো তো, একটু ব্লাড ব্লাড পিকচার গুলো। ভয়েস একদম ঠিক আসছে।
ওটা লাইটের জন্য হচ্ছে, কমলিকার ওখানে লাইট কম।
না আমারটা স্যার, আপনার আমার সবারই আজকে একটু ব্লাড আসছে, কেন জানি না। যতটা ক্লিয়ার ইমেজ দেখা যায় অন্যদিন, আজকে একটু ইয়ে আছে।
আমার তো মনে হচ্ছে লাইট কম আছে।
এখন তো শুরু হবে 4:02, যদি ঢুকে যায়। হ্যাঁ বেটার, এবার বেটার, ইয়েস ইয়েস স্যার, এটা তো বেটার লাগছে এখন। কমলিকা দেখি।
হ্যাঁ, আমি ক্যামেরা অন করেছি।
লেটস স্টার্ট।
ওকে,
এবার স্টার্ট করব, স্টার্ট করবে কি এখন?
তুষার স্টার্ট করছি তাহলে।
হ্যাঁ স্টার্ট করো।
Okay. Okay, so a very good afternoon to everyone attending today's webinar. Department of Physics and the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose College. I welcome you all to the 8th webinar in the series of webinars that is being hosted by the various departments of our college over the last few weeks. The Department of Physics, in collaboration with the IQAC, is pleased to announce the commencement of the 3-day international webinar on recent trends and scopes in physics. Before the start of the inaugural session today, may I kindly request all the participants in the Microsoft Teams platform to kindly keep their audio and video off at all times during the entire presentation today. I would also like to announce that the participants in the Teams platform, as well as those who are watching the live YouTube streaming, may use the chat box to post their questions to the speakers today and the following days. And these questions will be moderated at the end of the session as far as possible, as far as the time permits and as far as the speakers. And the participants are also requested to please not post their particulars like where their names, posts, or college from where they are coming, or exchange pleasantries on the chat box. Kindly use the chat box only to post relevant questions to the speakers if you have any, and the questions will be addressed at the end of the session. So with these requests to the participants, may I now request Dr. Tushar Ghosh, convener and head of the Department of Physics, Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose College, to deliver his welcome address to the gathering. Over to you, Tushar.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes yes.
Thank you, Kamalika-di. A very good afternoon, everybody. Respected Principal Dr. Chandra Maiti, Coordinator Internal Quality Assurance Cell, that is IQAC, Dr. Shampa Khashnavish, distinguished speakers, Dr. Deepdeep Sarkar, Vice President, Trading Strategist at Bank of America, Dr. Anirban Bandyopadhyay, Senior Scientist at National Institute for Material Science, Japan, Dr. Dipankar Mandal, Associate Professor at National Institute of Nanoscience and Technology, DST, Government of India, dear colleagues, friends, and my dear students. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the webinar on recent trends and scopes in physics, organized by Department of Physics in collaboration with IQAC, Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose College, Kolkata. This webinar aims at providing key inputs and encouragement into the minds of young physicists, researchers, and students regarding recent developments and opportunities in the field of physics, technology, as well as its effect in the other fields. We know that Physics contributes to the technological infrastructure and provides trained personnel needed to take advantage of scientific advances and discoveries. It is an important element in the education of chemists, engineers, and computer scientists, as well as practitioners of the other physical and biomedical sciences. It has also been established as a major integral part for analyzing market economy too. In this time of pandemic due to COVID-19, we are all at our home to maintain physical distancing. Using modern day technologies, we are working from our home, taking online classes, helping our students to continue their studies. In addition, such online platform is also helping to organize this kind of international webinars where we are getting the opportunity to and personalities from all over the world, which is further knowledge. With these few words, I welcome you all to this international webinar. I hope it will be a wonderful learning experience for all of you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Tushar, for your welcome address. May I now request our Chandra to deliver his opening address. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Kamalika. Hello. Hello. Clear? Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Honorable Speaker, Dr. Devdeep Sarkar, Vice President, Trading Strategist at Bank of America, Honorable Speaker, Dr. Anirban Bandyopadhyay, Senior Scientist at National Institute for Material Science, Tsukuba, Japan, Honorable Speaker, Dr. Dipankar Mondal, Associate Professor, Scientist E at Institute of Nanoscience and Technology, DST, Mohali, India, Honorable GB members, all my dear colleagues and staff, my dear students and honorable participants. It is my great privilege to give you welcome address to all of you participated in this 3-day international webinar. The various departments of our college, in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, have been organizing national and international webinars for the last couple of months. Today's event is the 8th webinar in this series. This 3-day webinar titled Recent Trends and Scope in Physics is organized by the Department of Physics of our college in collaboration with the IQAC. At the 3 lectures to be delivered will constitute of some spectacular and novel studies of the subject that have been done recently, and they will also present before the audience, especially the students, and opportunities that lie ahead them once they graduate with a degree in physics. As we all know that physics is one of the primary subjects of the basic sciences, and a mind that has been trained in the study of this subject can explore numerous career options and contribute to the betterment of the society. Our college not only gives importance to the academic performance in terms of student results only, but we as an institute would like to imbibe into our students the spirit of giving back to the society by being part of projects that will in future prove to be helpful to the entire mankind also. Keeping this in mind, we have invited speakers from different parts of the world who are working both in the industry as well as the premium institute of the world. In the present unprecedented pandemic situation due to the COVID-19, we feel lucky that due to the advancement of technology, we have been able to gather the eminent speaker who are all doing internationally acclaimed work. I also feel honored to announce that there has been a registration of close to 450 participants and that the entire events will be streamed live on YouTube. At first, I convey my cordial welcome to all of you on behalf of our college. I congratulate all the speakers who will deliver their most valuable and significant lectures, sacrificing time from their very busy schedule during this pandemic session. I also congratulate all the participants and students, faculty members who have already joined in this webinar to make it a grand success. I especially congratulate Dr. Tushar Ghosh, convener of this webinar, with all other faculty members of our college for their regular efforts and inspiration to organize such an international webinar during this pandemic session. I congratulate Dr. Biswajit Mojumdar, Dr. Bappa Saha, Dr. Komalika Hajra, Dr. Vivekananda Maji, with all other faculty members of their organizing committee for their continuous effort to make present such an interesting webinar. Congratulate Dr. Sompa Khasnovis, Coordinator, IQAC, and Dr. Vishwaranjan Mandal, Barsar of our college for their constant guide and inspiration and motivation to organize various departmental webinars in our college, avoiding all pandemic situations. I again congratulate all of you for your multidimensional contributions from various angles to make the event fruitful. I heartily congratulate all of you again on behalf of our college authority. With that short introduction, now like to declare this international webinar open. I hope you will all enjoy the following 3 days thoroughly and take back to this webinar. Take my heartfelt congratulations again. Wish a nice and enjoyable day. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your inspirational speech. Next, I would like to request Dr. Sompa Khasnovis, coordinator of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of our college, to welcome the gathering on behalf of the IQAC, which has been playing a key role in the process of organization of such virtual meets from the various departments of our college over the last few months. Over to you, Shampadi.
Am I audible?
Yes, but you have to put your camera on.
Yes.
Yeah,
It is on. It is on.
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
Thank you, Komalika. Respected Principal, Dr. Purnachandra Maiti, our revered speakers, Dr. Devdeep Sarkar, Vice President, Trading Strategist, Bank of America, Dr. Anirban Bandopadhyay, Senior Scientist, National Institute of Material Science, Tsukuba, Japan, Dr. Dipankar Mundal, Associate Professor, Institute of Nanoscience and Technology, Mohali, India, my dear colleagues, students, and participants. A very good afternoon to everybody. True, we are all at present passing through a hapless situation, but still, today I will not talk about the despair and hopelessness that has engulfed us. Rather, the bygone week has kindled a hope with a capital H amongst all of us with the overwhelming success of the phase 1 and 2 trials of Shadox-1, which was published in the 20th July issue of The Lancet. So at least We see a ray of hope and are keeping our fingers crossed as the Oxford vaccine Covishield enters phase 3 with confidence, and we can at least envision the end of this dark tunnel that all of us seems to have entered since the end of March 2020. Our ways of life have changed drastically. We are fighting to recoup ourselves and adjust accordingly in every sphere of life. The new normal, as we now refer to, has transformed seminars to webinars. But somehow I feel these webinars are food to the intellect of all academicians across the globe. And this international webinar, organized by the Department of Physics in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of our college, is no exception. The topics are extremely versatile and interesting in the sense that while today's talk will focus on how statistical physics can be applied to finance, where Dr. Day-1 Sarkar will speak about the real-life banking applications like trading strategies, tomorrow we will hear about time crystal and artificial brain. A time crystal finds similarity with a normal crystal composed of atoms or molecules, except that its direction of repetition is time, and Dr. Anirban Bandyopadhyay will enlighten us on this emergent area with fabulous ideas. The final topic is about piezoelectric and triboelectric effects. Those who are from the gramophone era must have seen a gramophone pin that indeed electricity from combing hair when the comb attracts small pieces of paper. Dr. Dipankar Mondal will speak about how such physics effects can be cleverly used in this pandemic situation. As we are all eagerly looking forward to these sessions, let's by wishing this webinar an all-round success. Thank you. Over to you, Kamalika.
Yes, thank you, Shampadi. That was, what do I say? You summarized the three talks very well. I mean, the participants would get a view of what they are about to hear today and the following days. Okay, so thank you again, Principal Sir. Thank you, Tushar, and thank you, Shampadi, for your inaugural speeches. So that marks the end of our inaugural session, and now we will begin the first technical session, before which, once again, I request all the participants who are joining on the Teams platform to please keep your videos off and also your audios off, because when the speaker will be delivering his talk, it is very disturbing if some background noise comes up. So please be careful that your audio is muted at all times. Okay, so I would not call upon anybody to introduce Dr. Day-1 Sarkar, the first speaker of the international webinar organized by the Department of Physics, the speaker for today's technical session. I would like to do that myself because, well, we are college buddies. So here goes the introduction of today's speaker. Well, I met Day-1 when we started our physics honors course in St. Xavier's College. And if I were to introduce him back then, I would not require a script before me because I would be actually talking about my best friend in college. Well, I'm still talking about my best friend, but the 18 odd years in between, that is when we graduated from college and now that we are all professionals in our respected fields, is really forcing me to hold a script in front of him as I introduce him to you, because otherwise I would not be able to keep track of the many ornamentations that are now attached to the personality of that boy from my college, from my class. So after graduating from Calcutta University with honors in physics, Day-1 went to IIT Kanpur for a master's degree in physics, following which he moved to the US to pursue a doctoral degree in physics, focusing on cosmology and astrophysics. On obtaining his PhD degree, he from University of California, Irvine, Day-1 joined University of Michigan, Ann Arbor as a postdoctoral fellow. After spending 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher in physics, Devdip decided to leave academia and join the financial services. Juncture, Devdip joined Carnegie Mellon University for a master's degree in computational finance. Upon graduating from CMU, Devdip started his career in quantitative finance at JP Morgan. After spending nearly 5 years at JP Morgan, he moved to Goldman Sachs, where he spent a little more than a year and a half, leading the effort to build and market systematic investment strategies for a wide. Roughly a year ago, he moved to Bank of America, where he is currently working as a vice president, responsible for developing quantitative investment strategies based on machine learning techniques applied to significantly large data sets, both traditional and alternative. Devdip has published numerous articles, including more than 10 in refereed journals such as the Journal of Trading, Physical Review Letters, Physical Review D, the Astrophysical Journal, and monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society with over 1,300 citations. Its technical journals, his work has also been showcased in mainstream news articles. So with that introduction, I would like to now invite Devdip, Dr. Devdip Sarkar, to deliver his lecture titled From Deterministic to Stochastic. And I'm sure it would be a really enjoyable experience for the audience as a whole, and especially physics students who would like to pursue careers other than academia in the future. Over to you, Devdip. Welcome to the webinar, and please go ahead with your talk. Devdip?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Cool.
So you can now start presenting.
Yeah, 1 second. So let me just begin, then I'll just go to the slides right after that. So well, thank you so much, Kamalika, for that huge introduction. And I think you have set the bar so high that now it is going to be a tough job for me to fulfill that. First of all, before I start, I would like to thank you all for joining, and I would like to really thank Dr. Ghosh, Dr. Maiti, and Kamalika for inviting me for this. It's really an honor to share the same virtual stage with Dr. Bandopadhyay and Dr. Mondal, from which you will be hearing over the next couple of days. And when Kamalika was discussed, if you think that you are not listening from the person who you saw in the poster, I assure you that I am the same person. It's just that I don't have any more hair left. So that's the most of the differences. So with that, I'll try to start by going to the slides. Please just let me know if you all can see the slides. Sorry, 1 second. My bad. Okay.
Yeah, once we start seeing the slides, I'll let you know.
Okay. Can you, 1 second, so let me go back. Are you able to see it?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Okay. So thank you again, and again, I guess good morning if you're in the US or on the Western Hemisphere, and then good evening or good afternoon to all of you in India. Thank you again for really joining and spending your Saturday afternoon listening to me. I hope it would be worth your time. And before I get started, I just wanted to mention that, so Kamalika mentioned that this talk is going to be essentially for primarily geared toward physics graduate students, physics PhDs, postdocs, even maybe master students. But then also I believe that in the audience, we also have several professors and then people who are not just physics students. So as a result, I think what she had suggested that because we are in this pandemic situation, I will actually start a little bit with kind of an overview of global economy during this pandemic. And then to do that, assuming that most of you don't really spend your time looking into economics around the world or exactly the pandemic all the time, and then most of you have maybe physics background or other scientific background, I will try to start with a brief overview of how business cycles or economic cycles work. And from there, we will then talk a little bit about how really this COVID pandemic impacted everything. And then toward the later part of the talk, maybe in the second half, we will actually address all the different types of jobs that are available if, as a graduate student in physics, you do not want to pursue a career in physics and you want to look elsewhere. As Kamalika mentioned, that back then, when we started at St. Xavier's, we both had the vision of doing research in physics throughout our lives. And then I think Kamalika actually has been doing that. And then so it's really, in today's world, as you know, as a physics graduate student or any graduate student, that there is a lot of bottleneck, meaning there are lots of people who are graduating and only a very few can make it to a professor or a researcher position. So I really, and we all knew that Kamalika would be able to do that because she was a star student, and then she actually is still doing it. So this is actually really a great thing. But if you really wanted to do something, if you wanted to explore options outside of academia, hopefully I'll be able to maybe show you some ways of what are the different jobs where physicists are actually really welcome, and then how they can be really successful in those jobs. So again, just to get started, I hope this is going to work. Yeah. So again, as I mentioned, we will have two parts of the talk. First, it is going to be about a global economy. I'll try to give you again just a brief overview of how actually the whole debt cycle, the economic cycle works. And if you are already too familiar with it, I apologize ahead of time for boring you, but I think that is important so that we are all on the same page at the end of the day. In a typical talk, I generally like a lot of interaction so that it is not a monologue, rather a conversation. But I know that today's situation is quite different. If you all start talking together, it's going to be a messy situation. So I will try to explain as much as I can. I'll try to go hopefully at a decent pace. But then if you have any questions, please write it down, post it on the chat, and then hopefully we'll be able to address it toward the end. I will try to maybe go a little faster than I had originally thought so that we have more time for addressing questions in the end. Okay, so with that in mind, again, the first part, as I mentioned, hopefully is going to be, I think, interesting to more people. And then when we get to the latter half, then at least it will be interesting more maybe for the physics graduates. And then before we get started, I think it's just really important to stop for a second and recognize that we are going through an extremely tough time. And and then maybe for myself for sure, and then maybe many of you, we are able to just do this over the internet. We are at our home, at our convenience. But then there are a lot of people who are actually sacrificing their lives or putting their lives at risk to keep us safe. And then not just keep us safe, as well as, the reason we are able to put food on our plate, etc., is because of all these essential workers, all these frontline workers. So I think it's just always good to take a moment to thank you. If any of you are there as an audience, or your relatives or your friends are one of these essential workers, really a lot of thank you to all of you. So I just wanted to get started with that view. Now, as I promised, the first part is going to be about economic cycles, so that we are all on the same page, so that we understand how detrimental this COVID pandemic has been on global economy, and then how we are thinking about going forward, how we are going to come out of this mess, right? So I think over the next 10 or 15 minutes, it will be just a very basic discussion, and then I'll try to go hopefully at a not super fast pace, but then again, please put your questions down if you have any. So when we think about economic cycles, how does that work, right? The first and foremost thing to know about is transactions, because everything starts with transactions. You need to eat, you go to the supermarket, you pay some money, and then you get in exchange whatever you want to eat, right? Vegetables, meat, etc. Or if you want some service, maybe you are calling some plumber to come to your place and then fix something, you pay them money and then they give you some service, right? So that's service. So you can buy either goods or you can buy service by paying money. Now, the way you pay money can be in two different ways. You can either pay cash, which in this particular case is represented with the green signs, or you can use credit. Now, before I go through, I should also mention two things. Number one, in this talk and throughout the next hour, hour and a half, anything that I mention is actually solely my view, and none of this is actually has anything to do with Bank of America or any of my colleagues who work there. So all the views expressed here is going to be solely mine. And the second thing is, when I was thinking about coming up with these slides, I thought that I would need some sort of visual aids to convey the message. And I could have tried to do that myself, but then Ray Dalio, he's a hedge fund manager of Bridgewater, he has done some amazing videos on this. And most of these graphics, most of these pictures that you will see over the next few slides, I've actually taken from his presentations. And I could have just said, why reinvent the wheel, just use his, but then I have to be honest that he has done an amazing job, and I don't think I would have been able to do that. So I have borrowed some of the graphics from his presentations. So that's what you will be seeing for the next few slides. So these transactions that we were talking about here, as you can see, so you go and then you pay either cash or you pay by credit, and then you get service or goods in return. Now, this is the main mechanism by which any economy works, right? And then the transactions can happen between people, as you can see here, or it can happen between people, as you can see here, or it can happen between corporations. It can happen between two different governments. It can happen between. In return, you will potentially pay them later with a little bit of interest, right? So this is how lenders and borrowers, they come together. And then remember one thing, that sometimes, borrowing debt has negative connotations, but that should not always be there. Why? Is because, yes, if you just borrowed a lot of money beyond your means, and then you went and you just spent it on, nightclubs, or you spent it on TV, televisions, and all of that, maybe you are not doing a good thing, right? However, let's say you borrowed the money, and then like what we see here, you bought a tractor, and then you were able to grow crops at a much faster speed. And that way, with the crops, you will be earning money and you'll be able to pay off your debt. And that way, the economy moves along, right? So even though this debt has a negative connotation, it should not always have that. It can be used in a positive way. Mostly it is used in a positive way, but sometimes can be used in a negative way as well. Now, why is this really important? It is important because what happens is when you borrow, you are actually increasing the income of someone else. So remember, when you spend money, it is someone else's income, right? So if you borrowed money today to buy the tractor, someone sold you the tractor, so their income went up. So this way the economic cycle works. So, and as a result, the concept of debt or the concept of credit or concept of borrowing actually enhances economic activity. And then I'll show that to you in a little bit later as well. Borrowers can be credit-worthy borrowers where they have probably good income. That's why lenders are always willing to lend them money. Or they can also have good collaterals. What does that mean? Let's say you have a big house, and then you can go and then borrow against the house. What does that mean? Is that I tell you that, okay, please give me X amount of dollars or rupees, and then I will pay you back. But let's say I'm not able to pay you back. Maybe some reason why I wanted to borrow the money to do some business that didn't really work well. But then that, well, he actually has a house. So I can go and then, take the house if he's not able to pay. So that's called a collateral, where you can actually put something that you already have as a collateral and then borrow against it. So typically that's the way this borrowing and this credit and then debit cycle works. So now, I mentioned about people borrowing. I mentioned about maybe corporations borrowing, but then there are also two big players, big players in the marketplace, and then I call them elephants in the room. One of them is the central government, or the government of any country, and then the other one is the central bank, which in case of India is going to be Reserve Bank of India, and then in case of, let's say, United States, is going to be the Federal Reserve. So the government, the central government and the central bank, they play a pivotal role in any economy, right? And we know that, but then it's good to emphasize what their roles are, because sometimes we get a little confused. So government, their main role is to make sure that they are serving the people. They have government jobs where there are goods and services. They have to pay them money. There are also people in the country who are unemployed, and as a government, they are supposed to take care of them, right? So here on the right-hand side of your screen, you are seeing that the government, they are paying money to people who are working for the government, as well as to people who are unemployed when they are in need, right? Now, how does the government get this money? Where is it coming from? So if you think about it, the main way for a government to earn money is through taxes. The government will tax corporations, the government will tax individuals. You all pay, if you earn, you pay income tax. If you're a corporation, you have to pay income tax. You also pay sales tax. So these are the primary ways the government actually earns money. If I were to get, now if this was in a room, I probably would have asked people to raise their hands if you think the government earns enough from tax collection to actually, spend money for all the things that it needs to spend money. The answer for the most part, in many cases, is actually no. The government sometimes doesn't have enough money from all the taxes to pay for everything. So what are the options then the government has? The government can then go and then borrow money from lenders. Now, who is there to lend money? So we already talked about this, right? There are people, there are other governments, or there are other banks where they have money that they have money that they want to earn interest on. So they want to lend that money out. And then those people and those governments, they will be willing to lend money to the government that really wants to borrow, right? So then, to summarize, the government, their job is again to run the country, so pay people who are working for them, as well as to take care of its people through unemployment benefits, through maybe some social responsibilities. And then the way they are earning the money is, number one, through taxes from the taxpayers, and then number two, they're getting money from lenders. So let's say a government has, $100 or 100 rupees that it needs to spend. But then from taxes, it is only collecting 80 rupees or $80. Then it can go and then borrow the rest, right? Now, it can borrow the rest over a period of time. Typically, what governments do is they borrow sometimes over a month to all the way maybe 30 years, right? Sometimes they would say, okay, I want to borrow money for a month, or I want to borrow money for 10 years or 30 years. And you lend the money to the government, and in return, what the government tells you is that, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay you every 6 months or every year a certain interest. It's also called a coupon. And then at the end of the period of the term of the loan, which let's say it's 10 years, I'm going to give you your whole money back, right? So let's say you are the one who is lending the government that 20 rupees or $20. You are going to get some interest every 6 months or every year, call it 50, maybe like $1 or 50 cents. And then at the end of 10 years, you're going to get your whole money back. So that's how the whole process works, right? And then at the rate the government borrows this money, sets the country's interest rates. So that's very important there. So that was one of the two main elephants in the room I talked about. Who is the other one? The other one is central bank. In India, that would be Reserve Bank of India. In the US, it's going to be the Federal Reserve. In England, it's going to be Bank of England. Then Japan, Bank of Japan, and then so on and so forth. In Euro area, it's called European Central Bank, or ECB. What is the role of a central bank? Now, government, as I mentioned before, they can tax you. They can, tell you that give me taxes. They can go and borrow money, but the government cannot print money. The institutions, central banks, they are actually part of the government. However, they are an independent entity within the government structure, and central banks can actually print money. Central banks can do is they can actually adjust interest rates within the country. So the Reserve Bank of India or the Federal Reserve here, they can monitor, they can adjust what the interest rate is. So at what interest rates banks will be borrowing from the government or the central bank, and at what interest rate banks will be borrowing or lending money from each other. So that's what the central banks can monitor and can adjust, right? So here you see on the left hand side, there's a lever. They can put interest rate up and they can put interest rate down. Why they would do so, we'll come to that very soon. Okay. So now really quickly, the debt cycle, and this is one of the ways Ray Dalio, he likes to describe it as a short-term debt cycle versus a long-term debt cycle. So first, we will quickly understand the short-term debt cycle, because that's what we actually kind of feel and understand better, because this debt cycle has maybe a span of 5 to 10 years. So every 5 to 10 years, you will have booms and busts and booms and busts, right? How does that happen? Let's just quickly go over that. So in this particular example, what you are seeing is that on the left-hand side, you have this person who actually earns $10,000. Now, I mentioned before, if that person did not borrow at all, if there was no credit in the system, he would earn $10,000 and maybe let's say he spends everything, right? Then he would at the most be able to spend $10,000. Now, remember, whatever you spend is someone else's earnings. So someone else is also earning $10,000. So it's kind of flatline. Now, you can still have economic improvement or economic GDP increases if there is a productivity rise. And that we will talk about in a bit. But now let's just assume that he can actually borrow money. So now this person who has $10,000 can actually borrow $1,000 against it. And now he has $11,000. And then now he can spend that extra $1,000, right? But then remember, we are thinking that he spends everything. So he spends his $11,000, or sorry, here $100,000 was $110,000. He goes and he spends that whole amount outside, right? Now his spending is someone else's income. So someone else now actually earned $110,000. With that, let's say that person can again get 10% loan, right? So now his loan or his credit or his debt is going to be $11,000. So overall, he has now $121,000 to spend. You see how this, if you keep on drawing this up and up, you will see how this is accumulating. And that's how the business cycle or the debt cycle works. You have more borrowing and that spending, that leads to more income for someone, and that leads to more borrowing, and then it goes on and so forth. And that's how economy goes from, I mean, this is basically the boom cycle, right? Things are all booming. Now, when things boom too much, what also happens is you have too much inflation in the system. Prices go up because, you know, things are booming. People are earning more. They're willing to pay up more. And then you will have there are more goods being produced, but then there is also more demand. As there is more demand, prices are going to go higher. So as a result, there is going to be inflation in the system. But the central bank, they don't want inflation to skyrocket. What they can do at that point of time is that increase the interest rate. Why? If they increase the interest rate, you will be less willing to borrow as much. Just think about it. If I told you that you can borrow $100 at 0% interest rate, you will be like, oh, yeah, just give me. If I told you you can borrow $100 at 10% interest rate, you will think for a second, should I do it? Will I be able to pay back in the future? Am I paying too much for it? So to reduce this borrowing, the central bank can increase the interest rate, right? But the reverse is also true. Now, when the central bank increases interest rate, people will be borrowing less. When people borrow less, they also spend less. If people spend less, then the people who are earning, they're also going to be earning less. This is what defines the peak of a cycle, and then the cycle comes back down. And this defines, or this is how the short-term debt cycle works, right? So you're borrowing more, spending more, and then you reach a point where the central bank would be saying, oh, it's too much, so they're going to raising interest rates, or some other economic shock can also lead to the peak of your economic boom, and then your economy starts to fall, right? And eventually you will have what is called a recession. A recession, you probably hear the word a lot. Recession is when your gross domestic product or GDP is negative for a couple of quarters. That's when that's defined as recession. And you might have also heard about depression. A depression is when a recession lasts for a long, and then you have maybe 10% over that period, and that's when we call it a depression. The last depression happened in the United States in 1929, in the late 1920s, and since then we have had many recessions, but not a depression per se. And as I mentioned, these short-term debt cycle or recessions have a life scale of maybe 5 to 10 years. Now, this 5 to 10 years, so here in this particular chart, what we are trying to show you is a bunch of things, so I'll spend a little bit of time on it. The straight line that you see there is actually kind of a long-term growth of any economy. And that straight line, that comes from productivity growth. Think about it, like 100 years back or 200 years back, we did not have as much industrialization as we have. Sorry? Okay, someone I think is speaking. If you could please mute your phone. So now that is going to be the productivity growth, right? But superimposed on that productivity growth, if you look at this small business cycle, that's the small debt cycle that we were talking about. But what you notice there is that with every small debt cycle, every time you have reached a higher level of debt, And then you remember, you reach over many years, maybe multiple decades, you reach a point where the debt of the whole economy has gone up too much. And at the same time, what happens is, you remember I mentioned that when economy is not doing well, central banks reduce interest rates. But then maybe by this reduction, they might reach a point where there is not much scope of reducing it any further. What if that happens in this red dot on the left-hand side? So you are in a case where there is a lot of debt in the system. Also, there is not much scope for the central bank to reduce interest rate in times of crisis. That sometimes creates what is called a long-term debt cycle. At least Ray Dalio defines it like that. Now, we will get to it in a little bit also. But before that, let me mention, when I'm saying, oh, interest rate may not be there, there may not be scope, what am I actually talking about? Is it at all true that there may not be scope for interest rate to go? What is the federal funds rate, or the interest rate that is set by the Federal Reserve in the United States? And then what you are seeing in the bottom is the same one for Japan. It's by Bank of Japan. So if you look at the top chart, you can see that the Fed funds rate in the United States was as high as almost 20%, right? Now that rate is zero. It's literally almost close to zero. It's between 0 and 25 basis points. So for all practical purposes, it's zero. And then you can see that it literally went down to zero back in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Then it stayed at zero for quite a bit of time, for a few years. Then the Fed started to raise rates a little bit from 2016, 2017. But then because of the pandemic, and even before the pandemic, they started to reduce it. And then after the pandemic, it's down to, again, as I mentioned, 0.25 percentage point, or let's just call it zero. So now think about it this way. If there is more shock in the economy, the Fed doesn't have much room, right? On the bottom chart, you are seeing the same thing for Bank of Japan. They have been at zero interest rate for a while now. And over the last several years, they are actually at a negative interest rate, right? Which should be pretty weird sounding. What is negative interest rate? That means I am asking you, give me money, lend me money, and in return, you have to pay me. And I'm not joking here, even though it's very early morning here, but it is true. There are lots of countries now. There are some parts of the Europe, Japan, they all have negative interest rate. Now, this negative interest rate is not something that as a mom and pop, you can go to a bank. If you have a savings account, you will still just get zero. They won't charge you. But this negative interest rate is what the banks will have to pay the central bank to keep their money, to park their money there, right? So again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that banks to do much, at least in the developed economies. So when that happens, there are few things to do to get us out of this system. So few things to do to get us out of the long-term debt cycle when you have a long recession, right? So what are those? Because, of course it happens, but it happens over a long period of time. There are 4 ways to get out of that. Number 1 is called austerity measures or spending cuts. The governments, and in our recent life, I think, if you are, of my age or younger, then probably the only one you remember is the one after the financial crisis, where Spain and Italy, they had to go through these austerity measures. So where the government would have to cut spending wherever it can. But that alone cannot always really lead to a successful recovery, because when you are doing austerity measures, you are spending less. That means someone else is making less. So income is also lower. The second thing is you can reduce debt. How can you reduce debt? So let's say, and it can happen even for you and me, for mom and pop, where let's say you have a large credit card debt, and then you go to a bank and you say, hey, I can't pay. I lost my job. The economy is really in a bad situation and I just can't pay. The bank sometimes would be like, okay, would they lose the whole money? Or maybe they say, okay, just pay me half and be done with it. Can you just pay me half? So that is basically what a reduction of debt or restructuring of debt sometimes is known as, right? Where you go and then you restructure your debt. Maybe you get at a lower interest rate, or maybe that's a possibility too. Another part is distribution of wealth. What happens is that, and this is something that we should be addressing too, is that if you think about what happened over the last decade or so, the wealth gap between the people, the high earners versus the low earners, have really gone up, right? And then the redistribution to some extent is when you take some of that wealth from the high earners to redistribute it among the low earners, and that is called higher taxation, right? The government can do that. Of course, you have to do it within reasonable means, but then at some point they would probably have to do certain things like that to redistribute that wealth. And then finally, it's printing money. Who can print money? The central bank. So how can the central, what is this printing money, right? People talk about printing money, but how does it really work? What the central bank can do, central bank cannot just pay you money, right? Central banks can print money to buy assets. So they have two things that they can do. We already talked about reduction of interest rates. They can reduce interest rates so that actually increases borrowing. I showed you the graph for Federal Reserve. If you even think about, I think later on I have a graph for RBI as well. You know that RBI back in March, they reduced this repo rate, or the rate and the RBI charges banks, by 75 basis points or 0.75%. And they did that again by 0.4% in May. So you see, and right now that percentage is about 4% for RBI, which is roughly 0 for the Fed. So the point I'm making is that that is one lever that they have, reducing interest rate. But the other lever that they have is they can go and bonds that we were talking about, the governments. Remember, we talked about government going and lending money, borrowing money. The government can borrow money from individuals. The government can borrow money from other governments. The government can also borrow money from central banks. So what central banks can do is they can print money and they can buy the government debt or these bonds from the government. So they are essentially lending money to the central government by purchasing these assets, right? So that's what the central government can do. And that's called printing money. Now that is not a bad thing always, right? If these things are done in a certain way to have a good balance, meaning you are not just going way crazy on your austerity measures. Maybe you look into the government, you see, okay, these are the places where maybe I'm spending too much, maybe I can cut. And we do that in our lives too. You just have to think about that a government doing, right? We can say, you know what, like we have too much debt. What can we do, right? And maybe, do I have an expensive car? Maybe I should not have an expensive car. Maybe I can then reduce my monthly payment for that. Am I spending too much on maybe 5 different cable connections I have? Maybe I reduce that. So these kind of austerity measures people do in their lives as well. A government can do the same. Then reduction of debt, that can be done in a balanced fashion, in a balanced way. People can get out of long-term debt cycles as well. Governments can. So now, before I then jump into the pandemic, so the reason we went over all this is to make sure we understand where we kind of were in the whole debt cycle before the pandemic hit us, right? And then for every recession, sometimes, not for every recession, in most recessions, sometimes there is such an exogenous factor that really influences. But the one interesting aspect of COVID-19, which was definitely devastating in many different ways, and then we'll go through some of that, the low earners, the poor people weigh more than the high earners. Because if you think about, and we'll come to this, you'll think about the jobs that have been lost. Those are actually not done by white collar white collar. Those are non-white collar jobs. Those are more blue collar jobs, and that's why I think it is important to understand the magnitude of the effect that COVID-19 had. But with this background in mind, we just spend really very quickly a couple of slides on maybe the current status of COVID-19. We all know, and you all probably track this every day, so I'm not going to be a psychologist, I'm not a medical expert, so I'm not going to really talk much about this. I'm only going to talk about a couple of global case count you see here. It's really enormous. The top countries that are affected, the United States, of course, Brazil, and as you know, India is now number 3 in that really, huge number of cases. And if you think about flattening the curve, there are quite a few countries who have been able to do that, particularly in Europe and some parts of Asia. However, if you see those lines for some of the trajectory for United States, super, I'd say comforting at this level. Maybe one small solace might be the fact, which I showed there also as an inset to the right-hand side, the mortality rate in India has actually been reasonably low. Also, if you think about what is happening nowadays versus when the pandemic first hit New York City, when it hit back in March, several things have happened, right? So number one, we were novice. We didn't really know how it would react. The hospitals, in some of the cases where you see high mortality rate, the healthcare system was overburdened. And that's why the whole concept of flattening the curve exists, because you do not want your healthcare system to be overburdened. We also did not have remdesivir. We did not have, of course, over the last few months, science, medical professionals, they have been able to come up with better treatments. So that is one thing as well. And then also definitely the population, the average age of the population to some extent probably played a role in that as well. So what you see is that today the mortality rate is probably lower compared to what you had, a couple of months back. Now, this is one thing, this is actually focusing on the US, and this is one, I actually love it. This is from the COVID project. You can check it out. Unfortunately, I don't have the data for India, but this is for the United States. And what you are seeing, and this is just an illustration, right? Don't worry about the exact numbers or anything. But what you're seeing is on the very left, you just have total daily tests, right? So tests have always been rising. We are doing more and more tests, no doubt. The second panel, here you see daily cases. And then as you can see in the US, we had almost flattened the curve, but then suddenly there has been a spike. So the daily cases are going up. Another very important metric to look at is the hospitalization rate, where you can see it is actually reaching almost as high as what we had back in early April, late March. But then also another interesting thing is if you look at the absolute, the chart on the absolute right, you will see that if you look at it, I hope everyone can see the charts, that there is always a month to 6 weeks of lag between where the infection rate starts to increase versus where the death rate starts to increase, right? Because of course, just because you are getting an infection today or you are getting, you're getting tested doesn't mean that, even if you were in the bad state that you are going to be passing away immediately. I mean, of course, there is going to be a time gap there. So, sometimes when people say that, well, only the infections are going up, but death rate is pretty flat. But then, you have to keep in mind that there is always that 6 week or 1 month to 6 week gap there. So, this is the current situation. And then hopefully we will see an end to it. Hopefully it will be in the rear view mirror someday. Of course, as you all know, there are lots, and I think it was mentioned at the beginning of the session as well, that we are optimistic about various vaccines. There are so many really, really smart people working around the clock to create a vaccine, to make it available to the mass. And hopefully, this will be in the rear view mirror at some point. We don't know whether we might have to take vaccine every year or maybe every 6 months. We just don't know any of that. So a lot of things remain uncertain. But then one thing we can be certain about is our belief in science. That's it. So just quick, some impact on economic activities because of the pandemic. It probably doesn't come as surprise that GDP, this is one is showing changes in GDP. This is for the United States. As you can imagine, GDP across the board was negative for the first quarter. One that you see positive is food and beverages, because of course people didn't stop eating, they were actually hoarding a lot of food. So food and beverages, those, I mean, if you go to grocery stores, etc., that actually went up, but then most of the other things actually definitely went down. If you look at employment, it was also a very dire picture. Most of the employment loss was understandable. People were not going and then eating at restaurants. People were not going to stay in a hotel. They were not flying. So, you know, you were not going into, you were actually, you were at home, you were locked down. So, of course, you know, you will have negative GDP impact on those. But then, as you can see, as those lockdowns were lifted, because things were in a really dire situation, you saw some rehiring. But then that again slowed down a little bit in June. Here is some high frequency data. So, you know, GDP and all, they come a month later, right? So it's you can call it a rear view mirror view of the economy when you're looking at GDP, because you're talking about the quarter that already happened. How about looking something which is, you know, high frequency data? And, you know, for all those, all of you physicists out there where you are looking for opportunities outside, and, you know, data science, as you know, is one other field where many physicists have gone into, because, you know, all of these analyses, they require a lot of heavy duty computing. And this is all, when you look at all this high frequency data, so this is one of the places where there has been a lot of hiring, and people from physics have moved a lot. And this, we can come back to it later, but just wanted to highlight that. What we're seeing here is the trend in driving directions, as well as walking directions, as well as transit directions on the left-hand side for the United States. And then on the right-hand side, you see this for India, and there it is only driving and walking. And this is from Apple Maps. So it looks like people don't use maybe much of a transit direction on their Apple map in India. But anyway, so what you're clear that people were measures, and then what the central banks do are called monetary measures. So in the fiscal measures, what you are seeing is that compared to 2019, this is a 2020 estimate of what is going to be your government debt as a percentage of. As you can see, way up there, right over there is United States. They have been spending a lot, borrowing a lot, and of course many other countries. You can see Asia, India would fall under that category, in the euro area. So across the whole world, governments are spending, and how they're spending, we already went over that, right? By borrowing, and who is helping with that borrowing are the central banks, correct? And then of course individuals. What are the other central bank measures? Again, here, you know, what you are seeing here is, again, all across the globe, central banks took a lot of measure to cut interest rates, to purchase assets, which is the government bonds, which is actually going to impact interest rates lower further, as I mentioned already, because if there are lots of buyers for your government debt, of course, the government can borrow money at a lower interest rate. So central bank buying government's bonds, that helps the governments borrow money at a cheaper interest rate compared to if central banks were not there at all. So this was one of the major aspects of central bank activity, is to buy these assets or buy these government bonds. And lo and behold, what you're seeing here on the top left, what you are seeing is the amount of assets the Federal Reserve, which is the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, has on its balance sheet. You can see the sharp spike around the coronavirus, right? There, of course, after the financial crisis, it had been going from less than $1 trillion to up to $4.5 trillion. But that happened over a decade. In only a couple of months, it went from that level to $7 trillion in just a couple of months. So that just tells you the extent to which the Federal Reserve, or the central bank of the United States, actually worked to fight the pandemic. On the bottom right chart, you are seeing the RBI repo rate. As I mentioned, that they slashed the repo rate twice, once in March and once in May, to reduce it to roughly about, exactly about 4%, which should enhance borrowing and then help with the economy. So that's the aim here. Again, we are now tying what we discussed at the beginning, the role of a government, the role of a central bank, and how they actually played during this pandemic. Now, we have been talking about what has been happening, what happened. So what's the forecast going forward? That's the looking forward part. As you can see here, that, generally there's the expectation that the economy is going to be really, really damaged in 2020, but then there's going to be also a sharp-ish rebound in 2021. Now, hopefully we'll get a vaccine. And then the reason why we think that the recovery could be sharp is because two things, right? This particular recession was not brought on by regular economic cycles only. It was brought on by government telling you, hey, stay at home, you should not go out, and that's to save lives, which was the number one thing to do, and we should, right? But now, if and when we have a vaccine, if and when we have a cure, if and when we are able to normalize or reduce the impact of coronavirus, we will hopefully be able to jump back quickly. But in the meantime, what the governments need to keep on doing is to make sure that the people, the poor who actually lost their jobs, the farmers who are not able to work, and then all the workers where they do not have any earnings, to make sure that they have food, they have supply of goods and then money until we get to that stage, until we get to that rebound, right? So that's what hopefully the governments are doing around the world, and central banks are supporting them by buying their debt, by printing money. Nice music. Could you please pause? Could you please mute? Okay, so then just a couple of trends to also talk about. In April, we saw actually personal income go up. And you might wonder, how come personal income, how can it go up when people have lost jobs? And that's because of government sending checks, etc., right? And then also you can see that consumption actually went down because people were not going out, people are not eating out, people are not traveling, right? And as a result, the savings rate actually went up quite a bit in April, and then it dropped a little bit in May because, again, there was reopening. But it just shows that there is a lot of savings that happened over time, over the last ever in history. And then moreover, there is a lot of working from home ideas that are being floating around. Some companies might just continuously start working from home. So people are now taking the time to invest in that home, in their dream home, or maybe some people are actually, selling out of their old home, which might have been, a smaller space, to go to a bigger space because now they are. So anyway, these are some of the trends that we have seen. Before I move on to the later topic, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of other things that we may not talk about. We talk about deaths all the time. We talk about the case counts all the time. We talk about the economic damage all the time. But there is also some shadow pandemic that is going on that we may not be talking about all the time. One of them, the left chart here, shows you the global, the impact of this crisis on extreme poverty. So you can see that in countries such as Africa and the rise in potential extreme poverty is almost 20 to 25%. That's a tremendous amount of rise, right? So that means this pandemic is actually setting us back in our fight against poverty. And then that's to think about that the shadow pandemic, how it has actually increased violence against women and girls. As people are all staying at home, there is more tension. Of course, if you don't have jobs, there's more uncertainty. So people are not in the best, their mental state. But then, that should not, drive these violences higher, number of violences higher, and things need to be done along those lines as well. So I spent actually quite a bit of time on the first part, and I think for reasonably good reasons, because some of the things I'm going to tell you over the next maybe 15 minutes is going to be tied to what you just heard before. So it's actually going to be quicker. And then we can leave some time for Q&A. So this is actually, if you wanted to have a career in finance, and if you are in physics or any other science field or any other field, so I just wanted to touch upon a few things, right? Just a quick industry overview. I don't have to spend much time on that because we already spent a lot of time talking about the structure, economic structure. I'll also talk about a little bit about the type of roles that are there if you're coming from science. And I would mention, as a physicist or as a physics PhD, why I think that you're in a sweet spot. I'll talk a little bit about some of the cultural differences between working in academia versus working in a corporate job, and then a roadway to success, right? What I feel that one can do to be successful in this career. So the first thing is key market participants. We have talked about all these transactions quite a bit. Now, in the what we are showing here is that, like as a corporations or, as a farm, you probably need money, right? And then we talked about that how you can borrow money by selling bonds. And then investors who are actually ultimately going to be connecting, or ultimately going to be connecting with you and then, lending you the money, they don't know you, right? So in other words, there are people who want to borrow, and then there are people who want to lend. Who is going to connect them, right? So that's where banks come in, because they know that, well, so there are certain institutions where they are called the buy side, or they are institutional fund managers. Many of you who have a job, or you had a job, you might have had, some sort of provident fund or some sort of 401k. That money sometimes get invested. You have heard about mutual fund. So here what we are showing is on the left-hand side, it's the mom and pop. You have your money, you go and then give it to some mutual fund or some pension fund to manage. They are called the buy side. Why? Because they will be buying from banks all these bonds or equities in companies, right? So corporations or corporations who need to borrow money, they will be selling you either company shares or bonds. And then the buy side firms, which are the mutual funds, the pension funds, etc., they are buying those, right? And then the sell side, or the banks in the middle, they are the intermediaries. So what they do by sitting in the middle is that they say, oh, okay, so this corporation ABC, they want to borrow money, and then here is the mutual fund XYZ, so let me connect the two. So they become the intermediary there. And then the XYZ mutual fund actually got money from yourself, from all of us, right? So that's the overall structure in which the finance, these are the key market participants. So you will often hear people talk about, are you going to apply to buy side or are you going to apply to sell side? What does that mean? Is that by sell side means these are big banks, right? Or even smaller banks. You can talk about, Bank of America. You can talk about HDFC in India. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. So all of these places are the sell side. And then the buy side firms, as I already mentioned, would be your typical mutual funds, hedge funds, other called asset managers or pension funds. They are the ones where you, as an individual, take your money, you give it to them, you say, hey, I don't really have the time or bandwidth to invest. You take my money and you grow it, because I might need this money when I retire. I might need this money when I'm planning to buy a house. So you grow my money. So that's the job of a buy side firm. And the sell side firm's job is to provide liquidity in the marketplace, meaning when there is a buyer and when there is a seller, they have to match them. The banks also do other jobs, which I will go to next, right? So on the sell side, as I mentioned, that you have the banks. They can be commercial banks where you put your deposit, they take the deposit and then they lend you money. You can go to, you have your deposits at Axis Bank or SBI. You also borrow money from SBI or Axis Bank, right? The whole idea is that they get the deposit. They, of course, pay you lower on the deposit than they will charge for someone who is borrowing money. And that's the difference the banks make, the commercial banks. You also have investment banks. Investment banks, again, the sorts of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or Bank of America, what they would do is that they would think about you. If there's a company, you want to take your company public, they can work with you on your initial public offering. You might have heard about that. They will also be helping with mergers. Maybe, you probably know that, there are lots of mergers happening all around the world, or maybe you have to, maybe some companies buying part of Flipkart or anything of that. So these investment banks, they come in and they play a role there. There is also market makers. Market makers, there's a buyer come in and then they join the two, right? And broker dealers are very similar. On the buy side, I already mentioned, you have the hedge funds, mutual funds, pension funds. They're supposed to be like, they are going to be raising money. They're going to be taking your money and investing in the market. Now, what are the type of jobs that we have, right? So in the sell side, you have jobs in investment banking. As I mentioned already, you can be a trader. You can call something called a desk quant. What that means is you build mathematical models so that the traders can use it. You can also be in sales. There is also called FIC and equity research. What that means is that FIC is fixed income, currency, and commodities. So that means dealing with all these bonds, etc. And then equity market means stock market. So you can be a researcher who researches on these markets, and then you send your research to the buy side saying, hey, this particular stock looks better, or hey, this particular country's bonds look better, so you can invest there. So things like that. There is also the role called risk role, where as a risk manager, what you do is you sit at kind of like you get a bird's eye view of different businesses within the bank, and then you want to make sure that no individual business is taking on more risk than they are supposed to be taking. So you want to make sure that the overall risk of your bank is within a certain limit, so that if there is a downturn, if there is a sudden market shock, you are not going belly up, right? So they want to make sure that everything is happening within reasons, right? Like the way we have moms and dads at home saying, oh, why did you spend money on this too much? You shouldn't have spent that much money. A similar job risk managers do have inside a bank. On the buy side, you can be an asset manager where you are managing others' money. You can have what's called a high frequency trading or a low frequency trading, meaning you are actively trading part in that transaction, or you are an asset manager where you have all this money from these individuals. You figure out, okay, so I need to grow this money, and this is where I should be investing in, or this is where I should be investing in, right? And then to sell side research, you are doing research on either companies or research on individual economies, individual markets. So these are all different types of jobs that you can find in each side. And these are all jobs where you need a lot of mathematical expertise, right? And as a result, physicists are well suited for that. Now, just very quickly, in academia, you have students, then you have grad students, and then after that you have postdoc, and then you become assistant professor, and then you become associate professor, I guess, and then you become full professor, right? Similarly, there is a hierarchy in banking. When you start at a new job, you are called an analyst, and then you become an associate, then you become a vice president. Then some places you don't have a director, vice president spans that particular one, and then you have managing directors. So you can either become managing director from a vice president, or you become a director and then a managing director. And on the buy side, there is not such a very well-defined hierarchy. However, it's kind of defined more as a role. So you can be a partner, meaning you founded the firm here, where you are actually deciding where you are going to put the money. Or you can be a researcher who is actually researching on stocks or bonds and telling the portfolio manager, hey, this is what you should be doing. Or you can also be a developer if you love coding. There's a lot of development jobs out there. Why do I think you're in a sweet spot? I already highlighted a little bit. Being in physics, having done a PhD, or even if you just done a master's, or if you have done PhD in any field other than physics also, if you're in a scientific field, there are few qualities you have that are extremely important in finance as well. First of all, inquisitiveness. If you did not have that, I don't think you studied physics, right? And then also enthusiasm. I mean, that is really kind of important, right? You are supposed to be an analytical thinker and problem solver if you are in physics. You have been solving problems even when you took physics in undergrad, and that's what we do every time in finance as well. You need solid quantitative background in some of the jobs I just laid out, and then you have that as a physicist, right? You should be able to handle large data, right? Now, this is where physicists had an edge, and nowadays everybody has, but physicists had an edge over mathematicians, or in the past, is because physicists were able to do the math and also had mathematicians back in the days, they paper, right? But then now that has changed, so that is very important. You have been some programming skills, and then you have to be a team player. If you did your PhD, I'm sure you have had a lot of collaboration in finance as well. Now, one thing that you may or may not have nurtured too much, but I would recommend you do, is your ability to communicate. Because if you're not able to communicate whatever you have in your mind well enough, then even if you have the brightest ideas, that is not going to be translated to the people who ultimately can use that bright idea. So as a result, I would recommend you practice that a lot. Now, I would hope that you're in a sweet spot, because being in physics, you go and then give a lot of talks around the world, you go to seminars. So I'm thinking that you probably already have that skill set. So these are the required skills to be in finance. And I think as a physicist, you mostly have pretty much almost all of them. Now, getting a little bit, again, I'm going to spend only like 30 seconds on it because it's just a little too much maybe for a generic audience, is that, I also think you were in a sweet math skills you have being in physics, right? You should be good in linear algebra, probability statistics, statistical mechanics or statistical physics has a lot of that. You might have done some time series analysis at some point. We do regressions and principal component analysis in physics all the time. And then in today's world, actually machine learning, simulations, these are also important. But then in many, many physics roles, you might have done some simulations as well. And finally, big data, right? I did my PhD in cosmology, and then I know that nowadays you can't do anything in cosmology without handling, large amounts of data. Maybe in some fields of physics, you may not have to, but then we are in all these experiences together. But you might be really good at some of them, and then that, should be sufficient. Now, a little bit of difference in the culture. Of course, there is a difference in culture, right? It would depend on one firm versus. Tell you is that it is extremely fast-paced and dynamic, right? And so one thing is that in physics, sometimes you might have maybe you are working on a project or maybe you are working on a paper, and then you have a decent timeline on that paper, right? You can work on the paper maybe for 6 months, or if you're in experimental physics or in experimental science, there's building the equipment and then maybe getting data. But then in finance, some of your projects might be 5 minutes long, right? So it would be a combination of everything. It is extremely fast-paced and very dynamic. You might be doing one thing and the next minute might change. Because the market changes, then you might have to do something. We were not prepared for it. We had to change. You have a constant feedback loop. When I was in physics, and that is I definitely miss many aspects of physics, many aspects of cosmology. One thing that I would say that finance actually is pretty good with is it gives you a constant feedback, right? Maybe you built a model, you apply it, either worked or you didn't. Within a few days or maybe hours or maybe months, you will know where your model stands, right? So the market will tell you whether you are right or wrong. So you have this constant feedback. And I already touched upon how project timelines can be really writing a paper maybe for months. Here, projects can range from a few minutes to a week to a month or even a few months, but it can be a wide range, right? Here, we are very client focused. We are in financial services industry. In physics, when you are writing a paper, you are extremely focused on that research. You are working on that. Should I allow?
You just carry on, Devdeep.
Okay, sorry.
Just carry on with it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll finish in a couple of minutes and open up.
Yeah.
Okay. So now the thing is that we already talked about most of this one. In terms of client focus, in physics, when you were writing a paper, you were really working on that subject matter. But here, let's say you have a project and you are working on that project and suddenly you have a client request, which is completely different from the project you were working on, but you have to work on that other project, right? The client request. So you have to multitask a lot. And you might be focused on one job, but then you might have to shift focus and then come back to your previous job. So that happens a lot. One huge difference is most projects are proprietary. Paper, when you publish it, you are basically the owner most of the time. And then hours can be more structured. And then, I already touched upon the multitasking aspect. Okay, now roadway to success. This is just a few things, as I mentioned, and I already was talking about. Already have your quantitative skills, right? They are already sharp. But then if you want to sharpen it a little bit more, some of the coding skills that you probably haven't used for a while, Python is something really good to learn if you're actually thinking about applying in finance. You can now, one thing that is a little bit of a dilemma nowadays is that 20, 30 years ago, physicists came to finance very easily. Nowadays, of such, doing a little bit more than just what you have done in physics. Maybe just learn up a little bit about finance. Maybe read the read about the economies, right? Read about what the Fed has done. Read about what the Central Bank of India is doing, right? So these are important for you to be abreast of market developments if you are actually planning to move into finance. Also, your resume should be very succinct. Unlike physics, unlike science, where you write a CV, a long CV, here you are supposed to have a one-page resume. Typically, people don't like more than a one-page resume. So if you're going to apply, please create a one-page succinct resume. Networking is extremely important. You should reach out to people who are already in finance. Maybe you have an alumni who is in finance. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are regarding these, but then many of the job opportunities you will find actually do come through networking, because there are such huge pool of applicants. Sometimes maybe you can make an impression by that networking and someone might like you and then offer you a job. Be inquisitive. You are already, because you are doing physics, I'm sure. If you're doing a PhD, you are. But at the same time, maybe be inquisitive about markets as well. And then now, because of the pandemic, it probably makes even more sense for you to learn up a little bit about those, what is happening in this economy, that economy, what are the central banks doing. I went over some of those, but, maybe continue along those lines. And finally, I must mention that you should follow your passion, which I tell typically everyone, because, if you don't like something and if you go in that direction, you will not enjoy it. And then, you will not succeed. So it's better to just do something that you love. If you are actually going to interview, I would say you should definitely do your homework on the company. There are some books. I have some bedtime reading on the next slide, which you can go over. And, in an interview, always be yourself and always be honest. It's very, very easy for an interviewer to actually be able to, figure out where you are not representing yourself truthfully if you are actually doing that. So be truthful and be honest. If you don't know something, I think nobody's going to, cross any points because of that, because you're not supposed to know that much finance. But then just say, hey, I don't know, but then I'm kind of the guy who would go back and find an answer and get back to you in a couple of days. And ask meaningful questions during the interviews. So I'll keep that. And then finally, just want to mention that on the last slide here, I have some bedtime reading that might be helpful for you if you are going to apply. I know that you don't have to take a note of this, but this last slide, I can send it to Kamalika or someone later on so that they can send it to you. So with that, I'd like to stop here. Thank you so much for your time. I think I might have taken a full time to speak. I'm sorry about that. But I'm happy to answer any questions if we still have the time. Kamalika.
Yes, whoever is that, please, can you mute your audio? Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. Devdeep, is your talk, was that your concluding slide?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you. Although I understand very little of economics and finances and etc., but I could follow the COVID part and the later part where you showed why students should actually, who can, how they might change their, I wouldn't say change, but choose a path in finances. There are certain questions that have been there posted in the chat box. And I'll just read them out one by one. This one is by Shoheli Rokhit. She's a student of our college, had been a student of our college, and then she did her MSc, and now she has been accepted as a PhD scholar in Tallahassee, University of Florida, I guess. Okay, so her question is, she said, I recently read an article wherein it is said that in case someone borrows a huge sum, like big corporations, at an interest rate less than the rate of inflation, then it's basically free money. How does that work in a time of recession when we may need to redistribute wealth, as you mentioned?
Okay, yeah, and I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. So, when, first of all, this concept of borrowing for less than inflation, I didn't really touch upon inflation as much. I mean, I think I mentioned it very little. So the concept is that, let's say in the United States, you have inflation roughly around 2%. So that's the target of the central bank. Sometimes it undershoots, which it has been over the last decade or so. But for argument's sake, let's say that's 2%. And let's just say you are able to borrow money at less than that, right? So which means it's also called negative real yields, meaning the yield at which you are, or in other words, let's say you are going to invest in a bond and you are getting 1%, inflation is 2%. So if you are actually an investor, you are not earning enough, right? Because you want to earn at least more than 2%. On the other hand, as a borrower, it's a really great thing for you if you are able to earn at less than the inflation. Now, yes, but then that always cannot, but then the answer, the question is, how that can also do redistribution of wealth, right? That can still do it. Why? Let's say you borrow at a rate which is less than inflation. That's fine. Now, with that borrowed money, maybe you are able to invest in your company, you are able to invest in your business, and that is able to grow. By growing, you are able to hire more people. So more people have jobs. And you are also earning more. So when you are paying your corporate tax, that's when you are paying money to the government. And then government can then redistribute that to people who are in need of the money, right? So the interest rate per se is not directly impacting the redistribution aspect. In fact, if anything, it can in fact sometimes help with that. However, what you want to be sure about is that by lowering this interest rate, maybe the companies can borrow too much, right? That should not happen. But as long as they are borrowing enough to grow their business and as a result pay more taxes and hire more people, that's actually win-win situation for it.
Okay, so Shahili, I think you got your answer. The next question is from Dr. Anjan Chandra. He is also an assistant professor at Malda College, and he has been actually we spent a lot of time together in Science College and then Shaha Institute. He does econophysics. I know personally, so he would know. His question is, are these kinds of wealth distribution? Should I repeat that?
No. Okay. No, that's a very deep question, and I think it's probably like tougher. Unlike the previous question, the answer is not very direct, right? However, I think the wealth distribution to a great extent, it's also about how well structured the government is, right? As opposed to if the government is efficient, if there is a very good collaboration. I mean, even though the Fed or the central bank is an independent entity, but as I mentioned that by investing in the government bonds, the central bank actually helps the government, right? So now how the government is actually spending the tax money, how the government is spending the borrowed money, how the government is actually working on different aspects of the economy or that they need to work on. Like, for example, let's just take the example of this wealth gap or the gap between the really poor and the really rich, right? One of the ways that you can fix it, or not really fix immediately, but one of the ways is that you raise the minimum wage. So United States, for example, has a minimum wage. Every state has their own minimum wages, but the United States as a country also has a minimum wage. So let's say you probably set that higher. Maybe you also try to do something in terms of healthcare. So a lot of activities that the government can do to can be done irrespective of which cycle we are in. Now, in this particular cycle, it's actually extremely tougher because the governments are already having to borrow a lot of money because the poor, as I mentioned, they got impacted asymmetrically, right? So as a result, the governments are having to spend more. But then, that's what they need to do is that it's more about the governance as opposed to the particular nature of the business cycle, I would say, where this should be done. Now, one quick point, when the business cycle is booming, that is when the governments should act in a way so that, they are prepared for the downturn, as opposed to suddenly waking up to the fact that, oh my God, now there is a downturn, so we got to do something, right? So that's why when times are good, I think we keep forgetting what bad times could look like. But then I think when the economies are booming, that's probably when all of these steps should be taken for the rainy day ahead.
Okay. Mr. Rajesh Mukherjee is asking, so is giving money as debt to people by the banks a good idea now?
Giving money by debt or giving money away? Sorry, what is
giving money as debt? Giving money as debt
to people?
Yeah, to people. I think he means by the banks, of course.
Okay.
Is that a good idea?
So it can have a broad range of borrowers, right? So are you talking about? So first of all, there are certain people in the economy, they got completely shattered, right? They don't even have the means to get money to eat today.
Exactly.
So for them, it should not be just borrowing. For them, it should be government literally trying to give them whatever they can in terms of either food or money for them to survive. Then I think there is a concept of small businesses or individuals who just need to borrow money at a cheaper rate now so that they can survive this or they can ride it out. and then later on when they come on the other side, then they are well off. So yes, I mean, why not? Because right now, so let's say that there are various small businesses who are suffering, right? You give them the loan now, because with the expectation that when we have the vaccine, when this is in the rear view mirror, when we are on the other side of the pandemic, they are then going to be able to stand up on their feet. If you think about it, right, if you have an ice cream shop, like a very small thing, you were forced to shut down. It is not that you did something wrong for which you now don't have your doors open. You don't have your doors open because some virus came and you were forced to shut down. So yes, you should get that money. So in the US, there is the similar loans for small businesses, as long as they are not firing people on their payroll. They don't even, in some cases, have to give back the money to the government. So yes, I mean, these are definitely measures that.
And also, I think now that many people are changing profession, especially in India, you know, these whole sanitizing products and masks. I mean, when I go out, I see people sitting with like people used to sit with what I may call like some. You know, the small shops at the crossroads, they are now sitting actually with sanitizing products and masks. If they get the money to sell, they would be able to make a livelihood right now. Okay, so another question from Dr. Chandra. What kind of innovative measure may be taken looking at the Indian economic structure?
So first of all, a huge disclaimer, I know a little less about Indian economic structure than maybe more on the Western Hemisphere. That said, you know, there are, so first of all, I think a couple of things that just immediately comes to my mind is that one thing is that I already mentioned, it's not about just the innovation. And I think when you talk about automation, when you talk about AI, I know that, you know, if you just look at the number of papers, and I looked at it a while ago, I just don't recall right now, the number of papers, etc., number of publications coming out of India versus various countries on AI and other topics, they were actually quite lagging. And I hope that, you know, that's kind of one sort of like investments that they do. I think more renewable energy type resources, because India is a huge, as you know, that, you know, India basically when it comes to oil, India is quite dependent on imports, right? So as a result, you know, when you're thinking about innovation, if you really have innovation on sustainable energy, be it solar, be it, you know, maybe gigafactory type battery styles, like the way that Tesla is doing. So things like that, when you do, you are actually thinking quite long term. And at the same time, you are going to be able to reduce your carbon impact, right? So I think that just solves both purposes. There's a lot of, I think nowadays, ESG investment, where E stands for environmental, S stands for social, and G governance. ESG investments is taking it's really in focus right now. So I think doing things that are good ESG standards, I think that over a long period of time is probably going to do better for them.
Okay. There's another question by Mr. Rajesh Mukherjee. Why the formula for calculating GDP varies from government to government, that is from nation to nation?
Yeah, so I think this is a little bit more to do with you know, exec economies and the exec economics economists who derive the GDP formula for that particular country. But then, you know, and the same thing is true. So it's essentially what the way the GDP is calculated is that you take a basket of goods, right, and then you are essentially figuring out how much overall product you are creating over a particular period of time. Typically, it's for a quarter. So there's a lot of variation between what that basket looks like, and the same thing actually happens in inflation, right? What the United States or the Fed is going to look for inflation. Sometimes, you know, you are looking at inflation or GDP when you are looking at everything together, or sometimes they would say, well, you know what, like the food and energy, we are going to exclude that from our calculation. So it's just a choice of the, you know, people who have decided in that particular country. But overall, the GDP calculation is not wildly varying. And I know that India actually changed the calculation a few years ago as well. And maybe your question stemming from that. But again, it's just a very specific, I think, direct answer to that why it is going to be different from an economic.
Okay, another question from Dr. Bishwajit Mojumdar. He's the associate professor of our department. He says, is shadow pandemic effect more pronounced in poorer countries similar to the African countries?
Yeah, I think it's not always. So there are two aspects of shadow pandemic that I touched upon. There are many others. One of them was poverty. Yes, for sure. For that, without a doubt, it's for poor countries. And if you also look at even within poor countries, you will see that for Africa and all, it's going to be more pronounced than Asian poor countries. And the reason for that is the dependency on energy, the dependency on oil. If you know, because of the pandemic, the oil prices, the demand for oil, those plummeted as well. As a result, those countries were even more affected. So yes, definitely for poorer countries, but then even within them, it's probably going to be more for Africa, unfortunately. Countries where, Yemen, where they are really dependent on oil, for example. To the other part, which is for violence, the data that I saw was actually all around, and I think even calls in France also, I think those increased. So I think for that one, maybe there is more, but that may not be recorded also. We have to be mindful
exactly.
that in a poor country, they are probably not even reaching out as much. They are probably not, right? So maybe that is not being recorded, and as a result, maybe we are not yet seeing it in the data that in
we don't even know.
Exactly. Yeah. So that one remains to be seen.
Yeah. So this is, I think, the last question that we'll take today. This is from one of our grad students. He says, if I really want to change my course of academia, what should I choose as masters?
Okay. So, and what is the undergraduate physics, right?
Yeah, undergraduate physics. Yes.
Okay.
He's, I think, in the fourth sem. Fourth sem, right. Second year.
Okay. So I think, so again, it depends on which field you want to go into, because I think you mentioned that you want to change field, but I don't know exactly.
I think he means finance, because he listens to you right now.
Right. So if you want to do something in the financial industry, I think, Kamalika, you mentioned that when I was switching my career from physics to finance, I went to Carnegie Mellon for this course called Masters of Science in Computational Finance. Those courses, they are also called financial engineering. Sometimes they call it math finance, financial engineering, masters in financial mathematics, all of these different names, but then they are all very similar, right? They're essentially there to bridge the gap between whichever field you're coming from and the field of finance. So I would say that if it is possible for you to join a course like that, that might be a very direct way for you to go from academia to finance, right? Because it's kind of a course that is geared toward financial jobs. So it's a no-brainer, but it just isn't. That these courses sometimes tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side. So sometimes what I have also seen that happen is that there are people who are coming out of undergraduate degrees, and then they go and then they work at a bank directly, but then maybe more in a developer type role, and then slowly they graduate into some other role, and then they eventually, if they want to move into some other country, they go and then study in that country the math finance courses, and then from there they switch. So I have seen different routes, but then if you really want directly finance job, that might be just your direct route.
Okay, so I would like to ask a question on the behalf of students, sure. Because you had completed your even postdoc, so you were already on the path of academia when it was your personal choice to, you felt that you were not reaching anywhere where you would get satisfied, and then you chose financial industry. My question is that suppose a person from physics who is doing, say, a postgraduate in physics, or maybe a PhD in something like econophysics or data science, big data handling, not only physics, even maths graduates, computer science graduates, statistics graduates, who are all into this big data handling right now. Do they have a chance to get direct entry to the industry without doing a course like the one that you have done? Is it possible?
Okay, yeah, no, that's definitely a very good question, very relevant. So maybe I should have even included a slide to begin with. So thanks for asking that. So I think there are two things. So number one, it depends a lot on where that job is, right? So and it was not only to bridge the gap, because I had by that time already studied quite a bit of finance on my own. But then in the US, I was there. I didn't have the right kind of visa to actually start working for a company directly. So I had to go back to school and then get this thing called practical CPT, which I got to actually get an entry into the finance field. So sometimes it again depends on if you are in India and then if you are going to start a job in finance in India. I do not really think that you have to go and then do this course. I would apply, and then there are lots of people, and I know that all these banks, international banks, they have centers in India, and they hire a lot of people directly out of college, and then most of 99% of them probably don't have a finance degree at their starting job, right? So I know that a lot of people get hired from IITs, and maybe some from IIMs might have some finance background, but then not the ones coming from science. So it is absolutely not a necessity that you will have to go for a course like that. You can definitely apply. But then let's say you wanted to come directly immediately to the US or some other country, it might be tough to get the visa to get started. So it just becomes then the question about where and when.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think there are other questions, but there are a lot of people who have thanked you. And there's one person who has said that he had no idea before listening to your lecture that a physicist can acquire so much knowledge of the finances. Yeah. So, okay. So thank you, Devdeep. That was what I expected from you. And I'm sure the audience has enjoyed the talk, and they have gathered some the impact of COVID on finances, as well as students who are interested in changing their course of academia once they graduate, as well as teachers who can now go back to their students and tell them that it is possible to actually branch out into interdisciplinary areas. Thank you very much on behalf of the Department of Physics, AJC Bose College and IQAC. I would like to thank our speaker, Principal Sir, HOD, our IQAC coordinator, all my colleagues present in today's webinar, all the participants, the faculty and the students who have participated. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
And thank you again. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you all for listening. And Kamalika, please, if anybody wants to know more about, what they need.
So we'll upload it to YouTube eventually, and then send the link to the participants as well, so that they can get back to the slides if they want. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we come to the end of today's technical section. Thank you all.